Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 30 of the Ecce textbook called Going to the Market. Now the main grammar point in this chapter is going to be verbs again, and you're going to learn something called passive voice. It's a new way of using verbs. The key is you have to think back to how we've been conjugating verbs for the first 29 chapters. You're going to use that exact same process, just with different endings. To start though, let's take a look at the chapter 30 derivatives. So the first derivative we want to look at is insula, which means island. In our book, we're really talking about an apartment building, though. But the words we get in English, the derivatives, all come from that idea of an island. So you have words like insular, insulate, peninsula. They all relate to this idea of an island. Next, we have vis, which means force. And in English, you get words like violate, vim, and violence, and they all have to do with being forceful. Next, we have incendium, which means fire. And in English, you get incendiary. If you call something or someone incendiary, it means they're kind of, setting things on fire. Or another good word in English is inflammatory. It's the same idea. It has to do with burning or fire. Next, we have infirmus, which means weak or shaky. And you've seen this word for a long time now, since the early chapters of the book. In this chapter, we're going to come back to it and talk about a building being weak or shaky because it's going to be on fire. Next, you have fenestra, which means window. And in English, we get the word defenestrate, which is one of those fun Latin words that students remember. It has to do with throwing something out of a window. But even in the Romance languages, French for instance, you're going to see words that mean window related to this Latin word and coming directly from it. Next, you have ornamenta, which means furnishings. And this is talking about the stuff that you would have in your house or apartment. In English, we get ornament, adornment, ornate. They all have to do with the same idea, the stuff that you decorate your house with. Next, you have the verb eikio eikere, which means to throw out. Now, this word comes right from yakio yakere, which means to throw. What we've done here is we've taken the preposition out of, x or a in this case, and we stuck it in the beginning to get this compound verb of throwing out. So when you see this word, think of the word eject. If you eject something, you're throwing it out. Next, we have quairo quairere, which means to seek or to ask. And the words we get in English all have to do with that idea of seeking something. So the word question, quest, conquer, inquisition, they all have to do with seeking or looking for something or asking about something. Next, we have opprimo opprimere, which means to crush or overwhelm. And in English, you get words like oppress, oppression, oppressive. They have to do with that idea of crushing down on something or someone. Next, we have dubium, which means doubt. And in English, you get the word dubious, which has the same meaning. So now that we've looked at the vocab and the derivatives, let's take a look at the first piece of the grammar, which is called the vivid or historic present. And we're going to see this is a way of using the present tense even though you're talking about things in the past. So let's stop and think for a second. Have you ever told a story to your friends or your family and you've used the present tense even though you were talking about things that happened in the past? You might have said something like, so I'm walking to school today and blank, whatever happens, right? Even though we're talking about something that already happened, you'd say, so I'm walking today, which is present tense. So the question is, why would you do this? And is it okay to do this? How do we use the present tense when we're talking about things in the past? This use of the present tense is called the historic or vivid present. And just like the name kind of implies, it's when you're talking about events in the past, but you're using the present tense to describe them. So the question is, why would you use this? Well, you do this if you're trying to make your audience feel like they're right there in the action with you. It's a more dramatic and exciting way of telling a story or talking about an event because someone listening to you is going to feel like they're right there in the action. That's when you'd use this. And it's totally fine to use this type of present tense even though you're talking about something in the past. You're going to see that in our textbook as we go. The main part of the grammar for this chapter, though, is the passive voice, and we're going to dive in right now to see what does it mean to be active versus passive, and how does that play out with our Latin verbs. So the first question, again, is what does it mean to be passive, or what does it mean to be active? So if you think about it, passive people are the ones who allow things to happen to them, or let things happen to them, while active people are the ones who go out and do things on their own. So you might want to think of, the difference between someone sitting on a couch and being sort of passive, just watching the world go by, and someone going out and actually doing things, getting outside, doing activities. That's the difference between active and passive. I want you to understand that because that distinction is something you have to wrap your head around before we dive into using passive voice with Latin verbs. So in English and in Latin, you can take verbs and use them passively or actively, and we call this voice. So the meaning is exactly what we just said between active and passive. An active voice verb is one in which the subject is performing the action, it's doing something. On the other hand, a passive voice verb is one when you have the subject that's not doing anything, but something is happening to the subject and it's being done by someone else. And you're going to see some examples of how this works. So for example, let's take a look at an active voice verb. If I said servi aquam portaban, I'm saying the slaves were carrying the water. My subject, servi, slaves, that's what's doing the action. The slaves are the one carrying something. That's what we call an active voice verb, and this is what you've seen for the first 29 chapters. But I could flip this to passive voice. If I were to say aqua a servis portabatur, now the subject is aqua, the water. The water is not carrying anything, the water's being carried. That's what portabatur means, it was being carried. Now the original subject, servi, has been flipped to the ablative, a servis, by the slaves. So in passive voice, I'm saying the water was being carried by the slaves. I've changed around the meaning slightly to show who's carrying something and who's being carried. So, like I said, so far we've been using all active voice verb endings for the most part. You saw a few in this chapter in the vocab list, and I believe in last chapter too, that were passive voice. But in general, we've been doing all active voice verbs. In this chapter, you're going to learn how we can use the passive voice and form it in the present, imperfect, and future tense. And there's a reason we start with those three. The perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, they use a different set of rules. It's a little more tricky, and it's just slightly different, so we're going to save them for another chapter. So the passive voice endings for present, imperfect, and future are r, ristur, mur, mini, ntur. And they follow exactly what we did with active voice with ost, mustisnt. We just changed the ending, but the person remains the same. So r is I, ris is you, and so on and so forth. We're just using different endings. So here are the steps for conjugating the present tense with the passive voice. The first thing you would do is go to the infinitive, you drop the re to get the present stem. Then you would add your passive voice endings, just like we did with active voice, but you use the passive voice ones, r, ristur, mur, mini, ntur. And you want to remember that just like when we were doing active voice, in the third conjugation, you flip the e to an I and then the I to the u in the third person plural. So I'm talking about the vowel on that present stem, you have to change it a little bit. One thing to note, though, is in second person singular, when you're doing passive voice, you keep an E in front of the ending, not an I, and I'll show you exactly what I mean with the example. The other thing you want to remember is for third IO verbs and fourth conjugation verbs, the third person plural has an IU in front of the ending. The other thing you want to keep track of is in passive voice, we translate the present tense as is being blank. So for instance, metor means I am being sent. Here's another example, and we'll stick with metere. If I was conjugating this verb to send into the passive voice, the first thing I would do is bring down mito. But I would use the R ending, my passive voice ending, to get metor, which means I am being sent. For the next 5 forms of the verb, though, I would start with the infinitive, metere. And remember, we said I'm going to take the infinitive and drop the re. When I do that, I end up with a stem of mite. This is my present stem. But since it's a third conjugation verb, remember we have to flip the E to an I. So now that I've flipped that vowel to an I can bring it down the next 4 times. Because remember, in the third person plural, I'm going to change it to a U. But for right now I have 5 out of my 6 stems, right? I already have metor, the first person singular, and for the next 4 I have mitti. Now to these, I'm going to add my endings, tur, mur, mini. And you'll notice I didn't change the second person singular. This is because, like I said in the beginning of these notes, in the second person singular, instead of an I, it actually stays as an E. So this is going to stay as mitte, and I'm going to add an irs to it. Now I have my first 5 endings for the verb metere in the passive voice present tense. For the last one, though, my stem, you'll notice at the top, I changed it from mitti to mittu. This is going to be the last stem, and I can bring it right down to that 6th spot. Now I just have to add on my passive voice ending, which is going to be ntur. And once we have this, I have all 6 of the persons, first through third, singular and plural, with their passive voice endings. And now I can look at the translations. Metor is I am being sent. Meteris is you are being sent. He, she, it is being sent. We are being sent. Y'all are being sent. And they are being sent. All the way down. And it's present tense. That's why I'm using the phrase am or are or is to get the translation correct. Now, this is the chart of all four conjugations, including third IO, and you can see the same thing is happening. There's a couple of different rules, like I said, for third IO and fourth, there's going to be an I, but otherwise it's the exact same idea as if I was conjugating an active voice. And here I've highlighted that one key difference where I keep the E in third conjugation and third IO. So what about the imperfect tense? The steps are the exact same. You go to the infinitive, you drop the RE to get the present stem, we add the BA infix, and then we add our passive voice endings. You want to remember, though, that for third IO verbs and fourth conjugation verbs, we're going to have an IE in front of the BA, not just an E, you have to put that I in there. And in the passive voice, when we're translating the imperfect tense, we translate it as was being. So for instance, mitebar means I was being sent. So let's try it with a first conjugation verb. Here we have porto portare. And again, we're going to start with our infinitive. And we take it and drop the RE to get that present stem. Now we have porta, our stem, and we add the infix of BA. So this is where we're going to start for all 6 of our forms. We start with portaba, and we add on the passive voice endings. But the stem is the same for all of them. When you add on our endings, now we have all 6 forms of this verb portare in the imperfect tense, passive voice. And we can translate it. I was being carried, you were being carried, he, she, it was being carried, and all the way down the line. And again, the way I can tell it's imperfect instead of present is I've changed the translation from am being to was being. So here's a chart of all 4 conjugations showing you what the forms look like when we're doing passive voice in the imperfect tense. Now, the one that you want to pay attention to, like I said, is you want to remember in third IO verbs and fourth conjugation verbs, there's an IE in front of the BA. Otherwise, it should look really familiar. It's the same process that we've been doing with imperfect tense. We just changed the endings. So now let's take a look at the future tense. When we conjugate the future tense in the passive voice, we start the same way. We go to the infinitive, drop the RE to get the present stem. But you want to remember that for future tense, it depends on what conjugation your verb is. If you have a first or second conjugation verb, you're going to add the infix bo, bb, boo. And you want to pay attention to second person singular. It's a be, not a bi, which is a slight tweak from active voice. For third and fourth conjugation, you want to add the infix a and then 5 e's, so a, e, and down the line. Then you want to add on the passive voice endings. You want to remember that for third IO verbs and fourth conjugation, there's going to be an I in front of the infix. And again, like I said, when you have a first or second conjugation verb that's using the bo, bb, boo infix, you want to remember that the second person singular is a be, not a bi. And when you translate the future tense into the passive voice, you're going to translate it as will be something. So for instance, mitar means I will be sent. So let's take a look at an example using portare again. The first thing I want to do is I want to go to the infinitive, portare, and drop the RE. Now I have porta, which is my present stem. And to this, we're going to add on the infix, bo, bb, boo. And again, you want to pay attention. The second person singular I've highlighted in red here is the be, not a bi. But now I have my verb set up to just add my passive voice endings and have the future tense. So when you put it all together, this is what it's going to look like. You're going to have portabor, beris, bitor, and down the line. And when we translate them again, you want to notice that we're using will be in our translation. So you're going to have I will be carried, you will be carried, and down the line. If you have a third conjugation verb or fourth conjugation, it'll work for either. This is the process. We go to the infinitive, which is mitere, and you drop the RE. Now in this one, I took off the ERE because that's where we're going to add our infix. So you want to start with MITT. Now we add on the A and 5 E's, just like we said at the beginning of the video. So when you do that, you have mita, mite, and down the line, right? The A and 5 E's. Now we add on our passive voice endings, R, RIS, and down the line, and we have a third or fourth conjugation verb in the future tense passive voice. And now we can translate. And remember, we use will be when we're translating future tense in the passive voice. So in this example, we have I will be sent, you will be sent, and down the line. Now here's our chart again showing you all 4 conjugations in the future tense passive voice. And again, you want to pay attention. First and second conjugation, that's when we use bo, be, boo, and you can see it on the left-hand side. Third and fourth is when we use the A and 5 E's. And again, I've highlighted third IO and fourth conjugation. This is where we're putting the letter I in front of our infix. So in other words, instead of the A or the E. So now that we know how to form the passive voice in the present, imperfect, and future tenses, how do we use it and what does it look like when we use it? So let's take a look at a couple sentences. Here we have two sentences, ad stantes auxilium ferebant, which means the bystanders were bringing help, and auxilium ab ad stantibus ferebatur, which means help was being brought by the bystanders. These two sentences are saying the exact same thing, it's just I went from active to passive voice. So the first sentence is active voice, the second one is passive. But let's take a look. How did I do this? What were the steps to change from active to passive voice? Well, the first thing you want to notice is my original subject, right? Ad stantes. That's in the nominative case in the first sentence. I changed it to ablative in the second one because in passive voice, remember the subject isn't doing anything. Something is happening to it. So what I'm trying to say is the bystanders are the ones bringing help. But when I make that passive, I'm saying help was being brought by the bystanders. This is our ablative of agent. So I'm saying the person or people in this case actually doing something are the bystanders, but they're not going to be nominative case. They're going to be ablative. So the first step is taking the original subject and making it ablative case. And I use the preposition ob to mean by someone. I'm showing the agency, who actually was doing it. The next thing I did is I changed my original direct object to the subject in my second sentence. So in the first sentence, auxilium is a direct object, it's accusative. In the second sentence, though, now it's nominative. And it's a little tricky in this example because it's a neuter word, auxilium, so they're spelled the exact same way, but pay attention to what they're doing. In the first sentence, I'm saying the bystanders were bringing help, that's my direct object. In the second sentence, I'm saying help was being brought by the bystanders. Now the third thing I did is I changed the verb around. So in the first sentence I had ferebant, which means they were bringing. In the second sentence I have ferebatur, which means something was being brought. And you want to notice that in the original sentence my subject was plural, ad stantes, so I spelled the verb with an nt ending, ferebant. In the second sentence my new subject is singular, help, so I had to change the verb around. It's not ferebantur, it's ferebatur because it's a singular subject. But either way, notice how I kept the tense the same, it's still imperfect, but I went from active to passive voice. So let's break down those steps that I just did on our example into an outline so you can follow along. The first thing that I do if you want to change a sentence from active to passive is you have to change the original subject, which will be in the nominative case in your first sentence. You have to switch it to the ablative case in your new sentence. And you're going to be using the preposition a or ab, which means by. You're showing the agency. In other words, you're showing who's doing the action. But remember, when you have a passive voice sentence, the person or people doing the action is not your subject. The second thing I did is you have to switch the original direct object in your first sentence, which will be in the accusative case, to the nominative case. It's going to be your new subject. The last thing you do is you switch the verb from active to passive voice. And remember, you want to keep the tense the same. But when you're playing around with active and passive, sometimes when you switch to passive voice, your subject is going to change in number. So in the example I was giving you in the last slide, the subject went from plural, ad stantes, bystanders, to singular, auxilium, help. So I had to change my verb around to make sure it was singular to match my new subject. So again, the number might change, but the key thing to remember is the tense is going to be exactly the same. And so you want to have that passive voice ending that matches whatever your new subject is. If you follow these steps, you'll be all right whenever you want to change from active to passive voice.